really warm welcome to you tonight. My name is Craig Roman. I'm the State Director of City Bible Forum here in Adelaide. City Bible Forum is a national workplace mission in every mainland capital city in Australia, and it seeks to engage workers in discussion of the bigger questions of life. And tonight, what bigger question than the relationship between science and faith? I was very, very pleased tonight to have someone moderate this who is both a respected journalist, both locally and with international experience. He's hosted Stateline for a decade. He's well qualified to engage in our topic tonight, winning a fellowship to Oxford University himself to study climate change and make an award-winning documentary, Mission Impossible, for the ABC and the BBC. So, would you please give a warm, enthusiastic welcome to ABC Radio 891 presenter Ian Henschke. Thank you. Well, it's a really exciting evening. We were sold out for this 2 weeks ago. We could have fitted another 400 or 500 people to this event tonight if we had a bigger place. But what a fitting setting to be in tonight. The Grand Hall of the city's university, the home of the Festival of Ideas, and here we are to ask big questions. It's like a huge time travel. If you've ever gone overseas to Oxford, this is a little bit like Oxford tonight in here. And that happens to be the academic home of our guest speaker tonight, Professor John Lennox. Now, John I met about 3 years ago at a conference in Sydney, and I watched his appeal to all ages, but particularly his appeal, how young people were riveted by what he had to say. And I think it was a bit of wishful thinking, but at the time I asked him would he consider coming to Adelaide, and we're so pleased that he decided to come, and by tomorrow he will have addressed directly over 3,600 people here in our city. John is a world-class speaker. He's conducted public forums across the world with high-profile atheists. He also happens to be a very pleasant and a very witty and very gracious human being. So would you give a warm Adelaide welcome to Professor John Lennox?
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the warmth of your welcome. I have enjoyed enormously visiting this delightful city, and my only regret is that I cannot stay here longer. Now, I've been asked to speak on the topic, cosmic chemistry. Do science and God mix? And of course, the answer depends who you ask. If you ask Stephen Hawking, arguably the world's most famous living scientist, he will say no. If you ask me, I'll say yes. So where do we go from there? There is a widespread impression, fostered by people like Hawking and Richard Dawkins, that science has made faith in God both unnecessary and false. And yet, that cannot really be the case. If you take the Nobel Prize in Physics, which was won last year by a Scotsman, Peter Higgs, who is an atheist, the same prize was won a few years back by Bill Phillips, an American who's a Christian. Now, clearly what divides them is not their physics. They've each won the Nobel Prize. What divides them is their worldview. Higgs, an atheist, and Bill Phillips, who is a Christian. And I would want to suggest that the actual conflict that we're talking about, and it is a very real one, is a conflict between two very ancient worldviews. The worldview of naturalism or materialism, which are closely related to one another, which holds that this universe or multiverse is all that exists, mass energy is the fundamental stuff, and there's nothing else. And the worldview of theism, which claims there is something else, there is a God who created and upholds the universe. Now, it's quite clear that at the top level of science, there are people of differing worldviews who are equally brilliant at science. So I suspect the real question we need to ask is this: what way does science point? Is it true, as Richard Dawkins would argue, that you cannot be intellectually respectable without being an atheist? Or does science point to nothing at all? Is it entirely neutral? Or does it point to God? And I claim that it does point to the existence of a rational intelligence of great power who has created the universe and who holds it in being. Now, how do we decide questions like this? Well, the only way I know, as a scientist, if you'll allow a pure mathematician to claim to be a scientist, and some don't, but there we are. If you allow that, it's a question of evidence. It's not a question of proof. At least as a mathematician, I have some idea of proof, and proof in the rigorous mathematical sense you only get in pure mathematics. In every other field of science and in everyday life, you can talk about evidence, proof in the informal sense beyond reasonable doubt, and so on. Now, that, of course, does not mean that we cannot have sufficient certainty to stake our life on something, even though we don't have rigorous mathematical proof. I cannot prove to you mathematically that my wife, Sally, of 46 years marriage, loves me. I can't do it. But I'd stake my life on it because I see sufficient evidence. I couldn't prove to you mathematically that the aircraft that brought me to Adelaide would get me there. But I staked my life on it. So we mustn't make the mistake that because we can only speak of evidence, we can't have powerful evidence. And I want to briefly draw evidence from several sources, and then I'm looking forward enormously to the discussion with my distinguished colleague Ian Henschke, whom I had the delight to meet in my college some years ago, where he won a very prestigious fellowship offered by the Reuters Foundation. So it's a very happy thing, ladies and gentlemen, that we're together tonight. So let's rehearse a bit of the evidence and then we can discuss it. First of all, history comes into play. History is enormously important because we can see from our perspective in the 21st century that there was an explosion of what we now call modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries under people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and so on. They were all believers in God. And that has led to a lot of thought and writing and research on this topic. Was there a connection between faith in God and the rise of modern science? And the answer that most scholars give is yes, there was. C.S. Lewis formulated it very succinctly. Men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. Why? Because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, when I put that to Richard Dawkins, he said, big deal. Everybody believed in God in those days. So, of course, it was believers that drove the rise of modern science. But he wasn't right. He was thinking everybody in the West. But he'd forgotten China in particular. And the Chinese are interesting because they developed superb technology throughout the ages, but they never discovered abstract science. And Joseph Needham at Cambridge was, firstly, a brilliant chemist, secondly, a genius at Chinese and an expert in Chinese technology, and wrote the definitive histories of technology in China. He was also a neo-Marxist, and he tried for years to explain why it was that there'd be no similar explosion of abstract science as we know it in China. And he found he couldn't do it on Marxist principles. And he came to the conclusion that the real difference that made the difference was the fact, I quote, that the Chinese lacked the idea of a single creator who had created the universe to run on laws for which he was himself responsible. So there's interesting evidence. And you see, that's one of the reasons that I'm not remotely ashamed to be both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject. So the interesting thing now is, where do we go from there? Because Isaac Newton believed in God, Kepler believed in God, they were thinking God's thoughts after him, and now we meet Stephen Hawking, who in his famous book, A Brief History of Time, which rates as the most unread book in history, most people get to page 4, and the diligent give up at about page 20. At the end of it, he talked about the mind of God, as you know, and it seemed he left a little space for God, but now he does not. And he says you've got to choose between science and God. Now that fascinates me, because you start with Newton, who believes in God and it drives his science. And you end with Hawking in Newton's chair at Cambridge, saying you've got to choose between science and God. So what I want to analyze briefly is what's happened in the meantime as I see it. So let me make one or two statements by way of clearing some of the fog, because I think the difficulty is created by fog and misunderstanding of a whole lot of basic things. The first one is this, that statements of scientists are not necessarily statements of science. At the beginning of his famous TV series, Cosmos, Carl Sagan said, "The universe is all there ever was, or that is, or there ever will be." Now, he was a brilliant scientist, but that is not a statement of science. It's a statement of his worldview, of his belief. So we need to distinguish between statements of science and statements by scientists, especially listening to me tonight. Because what I'm doing tonight as a pure mathematician is clearly not lecturing you in pure mathematics. I'm going outside my field. I'm addressing, from my perspective, the big questions. So you want a very strong dose, when you listen to me, of being critical and saying, well, some of his statements, most of them actually, are not statements of science. That doesn't mean they're false, of course. Because one of the dangerous ideas that's going around today is that science is the only way to truth. Hawking says as much in his book, The Grand Design. He said, its philosophy is dead, and it is now left to scientists to bear the torch of truth in our generation. Well, it's a bit of a pity that he says philosophy is dead, because the rest of his book is a book on philosophy. And I'm not going to say to you what philosophers have said about it. You can read that for yourselves. But it's a very odd thing, you see, for a scientist to fulfill so obviously the dictate of Einstein, who once said the scientist is a poor philosopher. The second kind of thing we need to get out of the way is the kind of wild associations that believing in God is the same as believing in Santa Claus. I was debating two senior men in universities in Delft and Groningen and Holland just a few weeks ago, one of them a physicist, the other a sociologist, and to my great surprise, they essentially both accused me of believing in a Santa Claus God. So I put it to the audience, and I asked the audience to put up their hand if they had come to believe in Santa Claus as an adult. And nobody put up their hand. But there were hundreds who had come to believe in God as an adult. So it's not quite right, is it, or sensible to put God in the same category as Santa Claus. Of course, this is the old Freudian argument, that if you believe in God at all, and it fogs the whole thing up, the God delusion is Richard Dawkins' assertion. It's a psychiatric term, actually. Well, it would have been good if he checked with a psychiatrist before writing the book. He's not a psychiatrist, nor am I, so I did. Andrew Sims, the past president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in England, has written a book, Is Faith a Delusion? And come to the resounding answer, no, meaning faith in God. But the interesting thing is that there's a best-selling book on the continent by a man called Manfred Lutz. It's called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, a brief history of the great one. And Manfred Lutz is a leading psychiatrist, and he says, of course, if there is no God, then Freud gives you a brilliant argument that belief in God is a wish fulfillment. It's a projection of your desire to have an intellectual, moral, emotional crutch. It projects a father figure into the sky and all the rest of it, if there is no God. Of course, he said logic would tell you that if there is a God, the very same argument shows you how atheism is a wish fulfillment. A desire never to have to meet God or to give account for your evil desires and all the rest of it. And then his bottom line is trenchant. He said, as to whether there's a God or not, neither Freud, Jung, or Frankl can help you. You've got to look elsewhere. And it's important to realize that many of the arguments that are brought up on inspection, they can be reversed like that one. And they leave you not one whit forward on the quest of the answer to the question, is there a God? Cosmic chemistry, do science and God mix? And the kind of thing that happens is very funny, really. And let me tell you this little story. Stephen Hawking was asked how he would sum up religion. Oh, he said, a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And the Times asked me to comment. So I said, okay, atheism's a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Well, you laugh, ladies and gentlemen. It shows you haven't been following my argument, because I said these statements prove nothing. But there we are. It was a good one-liner anyway. So the next thing is, I used to think that the fog was all created by confusion about the nature of science. I still think that. But I think there's a lot of fog created by confusion about the nature of God. Now, this may seem strange to you. I used to think and assumed that when I talked about God, people knew what I was talking about. The great creator of the universe that created it, inaugurated it, sustains it in being, a vast personal intelligence. But what I've discovered now is that many of my atheist friends, they think I believe in what is now called a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. The kind of thing the ancient Greeks believed in, the God of lightning. We can't explain lightning, so God did it. And then you do a bit of atmospheric physics and so on at Adelaide University, and you're sorted out very quickly. And the God of lightning disappears. And so a general idea today is that that is what the God of the Bible is like. And that is entirely false. Because one of the world experts on the ancient Near Eastern gods, a subject which fascinated me for years and still does, points out that all those ancient gods of lightning and everything else had one thing in common. They were descended from the heaven and the earth in the sense that they were products of the primeval chaos of mass and energy. They were material gods. And he says the God of the Bible, the Hebrew God, created the heavens and the earth. He was not descended from it. So the important thing to realize is this. When we talk about God, what are we talking about? Now, here's the key thing. If you define God to be a placeholder, an X that explains something that science has not yet explained, then of course you've got to choose between science and God, because that's the way you've defined God. You've defined God to be that which science has not yet explained. So of course you've got to choose between the two. But it's a false dichotomy because your idea of God is false. And it's very important to realize that Newton, although he had many flaws, he was an absolute genius. And when he discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, now I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God. Because he didn't, in that sense, believe in a God of the gaps. What he did do, which is historically enormously significant, is he wrote a book called Principia Mathematica, the most famous book in the history of science. And he expressed in it the desire that he hoped that his calculations and his observations would persuade a thinking person to believe in a deity. You see, like most normal people, the more you understand of painting, the more you can admire the genius of a Rembrandt, not the less. The more you understand of engineering, the more you can admire the genius of a Rolls-Royce, not the less. And the more Newton saw of the glory of God in the universe, the more he admired the genius of the God that did it that way. And you see, he wasn't seeing God in competition with science as an explanation. That's where the biggest fog resides. You've got to choose between God and science, says Hawking. Firstly, because he believes in a God of gaps, but secondly, because there are problems, a real fog around the nature of scientific explanation. What does it mean to say that science explains? When I learned the law of gravity at school, later on could derive it from later on could derive the elliptical orbits of the planets from Newton's equations. It was very exciting. I didn't quite realize at the time that the law of gravitation doesn't tell you what gravity is. Nobody knows what gravity is. And if you don't believe me, read Richard Feynman, one of the most brilliant physicists of all time. Nobody knows what it is. And the philosopher Wittgenstein, he caught the idea brilliantly. He said the greatest deception of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature. They're not. They're just descriptions. The law of gravity doesn't bring you a whit further forward in understanding what gravity is. So even at the first level, scientific explanation in terms of law is not complete on its own terms without going outside science. Point number 2, a scientific explanation is very important. Why is the kettle boiling? Well, it's boiling because I've lit the Bunsen burner. Heat energy is being dissipated through the bottom of the copper kettle rapidly because it's copper. It's agitating the molecules of water. They're moving faster and faster and faster, and the steam is rising and the kettle's beginning to whistle. No, it's not. It's boiling because I want a cup of tea. I'm glad you laugh, ladies and gentlemen. Can you see that the explanation in terms of my desire for a cup of tea does not contradict the scientific explanation? It doesn't even conflict with it. It complements it. And what amazes me, I speak in many schools, and kids can see it instantly, as you've seen it tonight. But why can some of our best brains not see that scientific explanation of the way the universe works is not an argument against the existence of an intelligence that designed it to work that way? You see, the nature of the God explanation is different from the nature of the scientific explanation. Let me make it even clearer. God no more competes with science as an explanation for the universe than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car. You need both. You need an explanation in terms of law and mechanism, let's say, the scientific one, and an agent explanation. It's a different kind of explanation. It belongs to a different category. They don't conflict, they don't compete, they complement. And so this idea that God and science are incompatible results from A, a misunderstanding of the nature of God, and B, a misunderstanding of the nature of explanation, and not allowing that explanation has got multiple levels. Now, these things are relatively simple, but they're enormously important, it seems to me. Now, of course, at this point, Richard Dawkins has a massive objection, and in his book he uses it as one of the main arguments, to my amazement, that if you claim that God creates, which I've been claiming all along, well then logic would ask you that you must face the question, who created the creator? You've heard that one, haven't you? And then who created the creator that created the creator that created the creator that created the creator that created the creator? It goes backwards infinitely, so we're talking nonsense. So let's go and do something sensible, like play Australian rules football or something. Yes, I do understand why you've got 4 goalposts. I've really learned something since I've been in Australia, sir. So anyway, back to this. Who created the creator? But it's fascinating. Let's do a bit of logic if it's not too late at night. If you ask the question, who or what created X? What are you assuming? You're assuming X was created. If you say, what created X? You're assuming X was created. So if you say, who created God? You're assuming God was created. But what if he wasn't? The question doesn't apply. It's as simple as that in a way. And the claim of the Bible is that God is not created. He's eternal. So that question doesn't apply. And actually you can see that. If Richard Dawkins' book had been called The Created God's Delusion, well, I don't think anybody would have bought it. I don't need Richard Dawkins to tell me created gods are a delusion. Freud has pointed that out long ago. We usually call them idols. But as usual, there's a little sting in the question. I couldn't resist this. You'll have to forgive me. But when I was debating Richard Dawkins, I said, you think this is a meaningful question, which it is, of course, of created gods. So let me ask you your question. You believe the universe created you. So tell me, who created your creator? I've been waiting 8 years to get an answer to that question. Again, it's another one of those things that's a double-edged sword. Of course, what's really being discussed philosophically is there an ultimate reality? Do the questions go backwards forever? I usually find they don't on either side. That my atheist friends will come to an ultimate reality, mass energy, the multiverse, or something like that. And I go back, not indefinitely, but to God as ultimate reality. And of course, then we have to ask which of those two worldviews, because this is the fundamental worldview question. What is the nature of ultimate reality? I ask, well, which of them makes most sense of what we observe? Now the next fog. It's all fog tonight, ladies and gentlemen, which is good because I can't see any of you because of the brightness of these lights. So I'm in a fog all the time. So I feel comfortable. So off we go for the next thing. The next confusion is about the nature of faith. You see, when I debated Peter Singer in Melbourne, I told the audience, as I often do, that my parents are Christian from Northern Ireland, and the audience tends to groan at that. Of course, he believes in God then. His parents did, his grandparents did, it's Irish genetics and all this kind of stuff. And Peter stood up and said, well, there you are. He said, you know, people remain in the religion in which they were brought up. So I confess that, I did. So when Peter had finished his bit, I got up and I said, Peter, I think the audience would love to know about your parents. Were they atheists? He said, yes, they were. Oh, I said, you remained in the faith in which you were brought up. Oh, but he said, it isn't a faith. Oh, I said, I was under the impression you believed it. And that little spat reveals the major problem. The idea that atheists don't have faith. And Christopher Hitchens, who's passing, I much lament, used to come out with ludicrous statements like, our beliefs are not a belief, our faith is not a faith. Because he was battling the change in definition of the concept of faith. It's now got into Webster's dictionary, not yet to the OED, but it'll get there. Faith, noun, believing where there's no evidence. That's not faith, ladies and gentlemen, that's blind faith. The kind of thing that some of us had faith in certain banking mechanisms, and the faith was not justified by evidence and the markets froze until there was enough confidence generated by evidence to get them going. You remember that? It hit everybody in the pocket. There's not a person in the West that doesn't understand what evidence-based faith means. And the word faith in English comes from fides in Latin, trust, loyalty, evidence-based. And all of you know that your bank manager won't trust you unless he's evidence. You all know why you trust your best friends. We all know what evidence-based faith is. It's very important, and other faiths, religious convictions must speak for themselves here, but the Christian faith is evidence-based. One of the fundamental claims of John's Gospel, where at its end John says Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples which are not written in this book, but these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. Here's the evidence on which faith can be based. I wouldn't stay here for a nanosecond if I didn't believe that my faith was evidence-based. Of course, let me remind you that I'm claiming God is not a theory merely, but a person. And faith in a person is a much more complex thing than simply faith in a theory. So you've got that side of it. But the problem is this. When I meet many of my atheist friends who are scientists, they don't realize, because they've redefined faith, that faith is necessary in science. Science is faith-based, as Einstein pointed out. He said, I cannot imagine a scientist without that faith. Now, he didn't mean faith in God. He meant faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Now, this is what fascinates me and brings us right up to speed in the current debate. And I'll point that out. You see, Darwin had a doubt. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. You can see the logic of that argument. And it persists. It persists to this day. My teacher of quantum physics at Cambridge, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, describes this in many of his books, If you reduce everything, including mental events, to physics and chemistry, you destroy meaning. He says that this reductionism destroys rationality. Thought is replaced by electrochemical neural events. Two such events cannot confront each other in rational discourse. They are neither right nor wrong. They simply happen. The world of rational discourse disappears into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. Quite frankly, that cannot be right, and none of us believes it to be so. Now let's have a philosopher comment. Alvin Plantinga puts the argument this way. This is the updated Darwin's doubt. If Dawkins is right, that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. Now listen to this. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Now, Plantinga is one of the world's leading philosophers. He is a Christian. So let me go over to the atheist worldview. And a book appeared recently which caused the equivalent of a nuclear bomb in cyberspace. And if you want to see, just Google it. It's by Thomas Nagel, absolutely at the top in philosophy in the USA. The title is innocent enough, Mind and Cosmos. The subtitle is far from innocent. Why the neo-Darwinian view of the world is almost certainly false. It has caused an explosion. And listen to Nagel, who is an atheist of the kind who writes, I'm an atheist, but more than that, I don't want there to be a God. So we're not going to accuse him of prejudice in favor of belief in God and so on. Here's what he writes. He says this, if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. Now, because our distinguished colleague here was at Green College in the old days, I'm going to finish with a story about Green College. Would that be all right, sir? We have wonderful dinners, and I leave it to Ian to tell you about them on a Thursday night. The only snag is you can't choose who you sit beside. Well, that's often a very good thing. You meet people like Ian Henschke, you see. But this night, I found myself sitting beside one of the world's leading biochemists. And he did as we do in Oxford. He said, what do you do? And I said, I'm a pure mathematician. Oh, he said, how dreadfully boring. And I tried to recover a bit and say, well, I'm actually interested in the big questions. I know pure mathematics is socially a little bit inept and not the best conversation over sherry. So I'm interested in the big questions. He said, what big questions? Well, I said, the status of the universe. Is it created or not? Or the status of human life. Is it made in the image of God or not? Oh, he said, it's far worse than I thought. He said, listen, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we've got nothing to talk about, we're going to have a thoroughly miserable dinner. Well, that's challenging, isn't it? So I did what I normally do when I panic. I smiled. And I said, you know, I think we're going to have a fascinating dinner. He said, are we? I said, you're a reductionist. He said, yes, I am. I said, what sort are you? I know at least 3 or 4. Oh, he said, are there 3 or 4? I said, yes, there are. But I said, we share something in common, you know, you and I. He said, what? I said, you and I are methodological reductionists. When we get a big problem in mathematics, biochemistry, split it into little problems, solve the little problems, get insight on the big problems. Yes, he said, I do that. Well, I said, so do I. Can we start being a bit friendly? But he said, I don't mean that. I'm a different kind of reductionist. I said, I know, you're an ontological reductionist, or possibly also an epistemological reductionist. But I said, let's stick with ontological. You believe everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry without reduction. And that's why you're leery about my talk of God. He said, exactly. So I said, well, why don't we do an experiment? He said, what, here at the dinner table in Green College? I said, sure, this is Oxford. So he said, what's the experiment? So I picked up the menu, and it said magnificently, not even in French, roast chicken. So he said, what's the problem? Well, I said, there's no problem from my perspective, but have a look at this. R-O-A-S-T. Yes, he said, that's roast. I said, how do you know? I said, those are only marks on paper. But he says, it says roast. I said, you understand it. How do you understand it? Well, he said, it's obvious. Well, I said, half a minute, you're a reductionist. Please explain to me, here's the question. Explain to me how that sequence of marks bears meaning in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. His wife was beside him, and none too quietly she said, get out of that if you can. But he didn't try. His answer was stunning in its honesty. He said, you know, John, he'd become friendly now. He said, you know, John, for 40 years I've gone into my lab in Oxford thinking that could be done. But it so obviously can't. And I was staggered. And I reacted playing devil's advocate, which Irishmen can play so easily. I said, you know, physics and chemistry have only been going 500 or 600 years. He said, it doesn't matter. You need an intelligence. I said, why do you need an intelligence? Well, because the nature of the gap. Oh, I said, not an intelligence of the gaps. No. The nature of it tells you that the only explanation is that you have to induct upwards rather than downwards to intelligence. And then he looked at me, and I could see exactly what he was thinking, that I wasn't bright enough to have thought of the argument. He said, where did you get that argument? I said, I got it from a brilliant Australian called John Sperry, who won the Nobel Prize for getting people to take consciousness seriously. And he said, I'll accept that. Ladies and gentlemen, isn't it interesting? R-O-A-S-T. And you just have to see a few letters, City, Bible, Forum. You just have to see the first 4, and you immediately perceive that an intelligence is behind that. Now, here's the next step. He was a biochemist. He worked on DNA, the longest word that we've ever discovered in a 4-letter chemical alphabet. 3.5 billion letters long, all in the right order. And he sees intelligence in C-I-T-Y. So I said, what about the DNA word? Oh, chance and necessity. Really? That's all. Just chance and the laws of nature. You'd never dream of it seeing this word. Because, ladies and gentlemen, my final point is this. It is wonderful when scientific explanation proceeds from the simple to the complex. But it doesn't always do that. Richard Dawkins says in his book again, he says, you know, God cannot be an explanation because by definition, he's more complex than the thing you're explaining. But that argument doesn't even apply to his own book. It's 400 pages long, it's reasonably complex. And I ask, what's its origin? And I discover its origin lies in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. So I dismiss that. That's not an explanation, because the explanation is more complex than the thing you're explaining. It's nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. Wonderful when we can get explanations that move from the simple to the complex. But where language occurs, where there's semiotics, the theory of meaning, it doesn't work that way. And therefore, I close with this. There are two worldviews we're thinking of tonight. One essentially starts with in the beginning were the particles, an empty space, or the multiverse or something. And they produced, by the laws of nature, wherever those came from, they produced galaxies and stars and planets and life and human beings and intelligence and the idea of God, because there isn't a God. The other worldview is this: in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. Do you see the difference? In the one, mass energy is primary and mind is derivative. In the other, mind is primary and mass energy is derivative. And an increasing number of philosophers and thinkers are beginning to see that Darwin's doubt is valid after all. If you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it tomorrow? But the atheist's asking me to do that with my mind. You see, ladies and gentlemen, my biggest difficulty with the atheist worldview is not that I'm a Christian. It's that I'm a scientist. And I am not impressed by a worldview that doesn't simply shoot itself in the foot, but shoots itself in the brain. Thank you very much.
Well, I think you deserve a drink of water after that.
Oh, I'm very grateful, sir. Thank you.
And thank you very much for reminding me about Green College. It was back in 1999, and when people say to me, do you believe in a God? And I say, yes, there has to be, because I've been to heaven. It was called Green College. You came up with some wonderful one-liners tonight, and some two-liners and three-liners and four-liners. And I had the great pleasure today on 891 on the ABC to interview you. And we talked a bit about Christopher Hitchens, and
Yes.
I thought it might be nice seeing you mentioned some of the other people that you've spoken a bit to and debated with. You actually have, along the way, you've had Dawkins, Singer and Hitchens. But Hitchens was a bit like the man you were talking about at the end, wasn't it? Where you sat down next to him and within a short space of time you became friends.
That's right. Absolutely, yes.
And he gave a great one-liner as well, didn't he, Christopher Hitchens? And perhaps we should share that tonight. When he was talking about Ireland, Hitchens said that he had been to these places, the war zones, and he remembered the time when someone had stopped him at a checkpoint and they'd literally jumped out wearing balaclavas and shoved a gun into his ear and said, "Are you a Protestant or a Catholic?" And Hitchens said, "Well, I'm an atheist." And in true Irish fashion, the person said, "Well, are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist?"
You see, ladies and gentlemen, that is the thing I have to live down.
But Hitchens, in a way, was a good match for you, wasn't he? Because you shared, I suppose, a sensibility, the two of you. And I suppose that's the thing you're talking about. Some of these people that you debate, you're not enemies, are you?
No. I feel that in public debate, it's so important, as far as possible, to befriend people, to get out of the way that confrontation and so on. Because we're not ad hominem. We're not arguing against people. We're arguing, sometimes fiercely, against ideas. But my ideal is go and argue as fiercely as possible with great respect for your opponent, and then go out and have a meal or a drink together. And if I can't do the latter, I'm not keen on doing the former.
Now, we mentioned before about the number of people that you've spoken to in Adelaide, because you went on the radio today, and if we had a good day, we probably had 20,000 there, and you're going to do another probably 5,000 before you leave town. So about 1 in every 40 people in Adelaide will have heard you. Do you think people are actually changing their view because of what you're doing? Because if you look at the other side, it's been very strong in the other way, hasn't it? I mean, the Dawkins and the people you've mentioned before, the other philosophers and scientists that are out there on the other side, you're a bit of a lone voice.
I don't really feel I'm a lone voice, but to answer your first question, Ian, yeah, they are changing their minds. I mean, one of the most encouraging things to me, of course, when I debate someone like Dawkins or Hitchens, I'm not an idiot. I don't expect them to be converted on stage kind of thing. But what I hope is this, that at least amidst all the toing and froing, I can put some kind of rational argument, a credible argument for God out into the public space. And I have sufficient confidence in people that they're able to judge. And I have had, over the past years, since I debated Dawkins, it's 8 years ago, I think, since the first debate, I've had dozens and dozens of letters from people who have become Christians through watching the debates. So that encourages me greatly. And people write in and they have developed interest in this kind of thing, and they feel that they've got some kind of answers to the big questions. If that didn't happen, I would not be interested. You see, if I backtrack, you mentioned Ireland, and that was a brilliant Irish accent, you know. I can't do an Australian accent at all.
Well, I had a great teacher because when I was at the ABC, we had a man there called Peter Elliott, and he used to work for the BBC. And he said that there was a fellow called Brian Redhead. Do you remember him?
Oh, yes, I do.
He
indeed,
covered
yes.
Northern Ireland.
Yes, that's right.
And Peter Elliott used to tell this story, and he told it a few times, so I heard the accent, but it was Ian Paisley.
Oh, yes, I thought you were doing Ian Paisley.
Yes, it was Ian Paisley.
Very impressive.
And he said that he was there one day filming Ian Paisley, and he said in the midst of his speech, Paisley turned around and he said, and if anyone had seen the BBC last night and seen Mr. Brian Redhead and his film crew who are standing over there on the left-hand side, and he said they picked the cameras up and they ran for the car and they got out of there. And he was reminded of that when he saw that terrible incident where the car was trapped. Remember on the news a few years ago, and a man was pulled out and killed, and he said, I'm so glad I'm out of there. And this is something that has come up tonight. You're talking about the fact that you come from Northern Ireland.
Yes, I do.
And whenever people talk about God and religion, they bring in war, hatred,
They do, yes,
death.
they do indeed.
You avoid that.
No, I don't. Well, avoid war.
You avoided it.
Sorry,
You avoided that tonight, though, the discussion of...
Oh, I did indeed, because I noticed the title was Cosmic Chemistry. Do science and God mix? But your question is utterly legitimate. What I was going to say about Northern Ireland is my own fault for bringing it up again, of course, was that because I come from a Christian background that runs several generations, at Cambridge something happened, and it happened very early on. Your point was made to me very forcibly at dinner. A chap said to me, do you believe in God? And then he said, oh, sorry, I should not have asked you that question. You're Irish. You Irish all believe in God, and you fight about it. And it was that decided me, okay, let's really investigate this charge. Is it Irish genetics? Or is it true? So I deliberately, in my first week as a student, searched out people who'd never been to church, whose parents were not Christians, who didn't share my worldview. And I've been doing it ever since. So it's in a way a deep-seated interest in answering the question, not is Christianity helpful, but is it true? Now, your question comes in, but they fight about it. And I was remarkably blessed, I can only put it that way, in having parents who were Christian, but their Christianity was the exact opposite of sectarian, and that was very unusual. My parents had a store. They employed at the best of times 40 or 50 people in one of those stores that disappeared when the supermarkets came. And my dad, because he believed the biblical statement that all human beings are made in the image of God, he employed equally Protestant and Catholics, even if they were both atheists, if you see what I mean. And he was bombed for that. So he had real trouble for that. My brother was nearly killed. And he didn't lose his faith in God. And I'm often asked about this. How have you retained your faith in God when so many of your contemporaries, when they got to university, they'd had it drummed into them by the drums often. When they were young, they got out, they went to England, they had no interest in God after that. And I say to them, look, the way I look at the violence is in Northern Ireland. is it's complex. Of course, you know as a journalist, it's not just a simplistic religious war. There were sociological factors and so on and so forth. But suppose it was. Suppose the whole story is correct. I would say, the first thing I would say is I'm utterly ashamed of it. I'm ashamed, that is, that the name of Christ has ever been associated with a bomb or an AK-47. But then the next important thing, which I talked to Christopher Hitchens about at great length, because at the Edinburgh Festival where we debated, he got up and gave a passionate denouement of the unacceptable face of religion, the religious wars, and he was a war correspondent, as you know, and he'd seen it all. And I got up after him and said, Christopher, I couldn't agree with you more. I grant you that. That is the unacceptable face of religion. And the trouble is that if you look at Christ now, other religions must defend themselves in this. That's not my task. My task is to just notice a glaring historical fact, that the criticism that Christopher and others made of religion were what Christ was put on trial for. He was accused of being a political terrorist, fomenting trouble, and therefore being a political threat to Rome. The interesting thing was he was declared innocent of that charge. Now that's very important, because it tells me, you see, that people that take up guns or weapons to defend Christ or his message are not following him, they're disobeying him, they're not Christian.
And look, by the way, when we talked this morning, we did record it and put it up on the internet, the new technology. Of course, in the beginning was the Word, and then came the internet. It's actually up there, so if you want to Google 891 Mornings and Professor John Lennox, you'll find it there. And we also found out this morning that John actually speaks a number of languages. You speak German fluently. We heard a bit of that tonight. You speak Russian. You speak Spanish. And you also speak intellectual, because I was having trouble following that there for a while.
That last bit, I don't believe.
Yeah. One thing we didn't talk about this morning, and I would like to ask it, and we will get to questions that are coming into us in a moment, but this is a question that I wanted to ask this morning. And this was that you've got degrees from Cardiff University, Cambridge University, and Oxford University.
Yes, that's right.
Your
I'm
lecturers,
perishing by degrees.
Yeah, I know, perishing by degrees. It's got more degrees than a compass. But you did go to lectures by C.S. Lewis, and I just wonder what it was like. I was fortunate when I was at Green College to have lectures by people like Sir John Horton, who was the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
He's a very good friend of mine.
He's also a committed Christian too.
He is, and has written a fascinating book on it. Yes, but anyway.
There you go. We'll talk about that later. But,
okay.
But when I saw these names in Oxford going around, you see the little corner where Tolkien sat and had a beer, but they seemed a bit distant to me. But to you, they were real. They were your lecturers. Tell me about C.S. Lewis. What was it?
Well, what happened was C.S. Lewis had a profound influence on me. He came from Northern Ireland. But the difference is, I don't know what it's like to be an adult and not believe in God. Lewis did. So in a way, he has been a mentor for me in uncharted land, what it feels like on the inside to be an atheist, wrestle with the big questions, become a Christian. And of course, his ability is just stunning. But anyway, I knew when I went to Cambridge in 1962 that he was still there. I had no idea who was dying, and he'd not lectured, and then he'd agreed to come back in the Michaelmas term, which is my first term. And the English faculty rooms were just opposite the maths faculty rooms. So without many pangs of conscience, when the maths got boring, I shot across the road and mingled with Lewis. And I must tell you what it was like. Would you like to hear what the lecture was like?
Would you like to hear what it was like?
Yes, well, it was packed. Students on the windows of the doors, no health and safety rules in those days. And it was winter, it was cold, there was a big double door. And at exactly the right time, the doors would plunge open, and this burly figure with a hat, a scarf, and a coat would come in, and he'd start lecturing instantly. Pick his way through the students, gradually taking off his hat and unwinding the scarf. By the time he'd got his coat off, you had 5 minutes of a scintillating exposition of John Donne.
From the moment he walked through?
Yes, from the moment he walked through the door. And I watched this absolutely mesmerized because his command of English language was spectacular. But then he reversed the process at the end of the lecture. So he kept lecturing as he put on his hat, as he wound on his scarf, and as he put on the coat. And the very last words were uttered as he disappeared out through the door. There was no Q&A.
No Q&A?
No Q&A.
All right, well, there's Q&A here tonight, and it's being done via this laptop. So we're going to do some lap dancing now.
Yeah,
all right?
fine,
Okay.
yes, go ahead.
First question that comes through in here is, what is the origin of the mathematical laws? Has your study of mathematics contributed to your faith?
Well, the origin of the mathematical laws, there are various views. The question one step back is the origin of mathematics. That is, are we describing what's there, or are we inventing it, the descriptions of what's there? And as a person who believes that God has made us in his image, he the creator has made us creators, I think mathematics is probably both. It's both discovered and invented. Now, the origin of the laws, we have to first ask what the status of the laws is. Because the trouble is, we use the word law in a forensic sense for the laws of South Australia, for instance. A mathematical law is simply, and I refer to what I was saying about Wittgenstein, a description of what normally happens. So where did what normally happens comes from? You know, a simple law, as Stephen Hawking puts in his book, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, you see. That's the first law he mentions. Now, that arises from our observations of a natural phenomenon that we believe to be outside ourselves. So we are codifying what is there in some sense. And so the laws are descriptions of what normally happens. They're not causes of anything. Newton's laws have never shifted a billiard ball in the history of the universe. People accused do that. It describes the motion. So I believe in that sense, and it seems trite to say so, because what does it mean? But the laws are our descriptions of something out there. And of course, what is out there was created by God. And therefore I think, and that could lead us down a tremendously interesting trail, but we needn't go there. I think Hawking is wrong when, for example, he says, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. That's a central statement of his recent bestseller. Because there is a law of gravity, as if a law can create anything. But I mean, the law that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west doesn't create the sun, or the east, or the west. It simply describes what happens. So I think there's a confusion there. But that's my brief answer. Mathematics and my faith in God, I presume the questioner means. If you say mathematics and my faith, of course I have faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. There's faith in my science, but I think the questioner probably means faith in God. It's helped it enormously, you see, because I think that in an indirect way, I mean, there's no equation e to the 2 pi I plus 3 minus 10 divided by what, and therefore God exists. That's nonsensical. But at the next level up, what we call the meta level, the fact that we can do mathematics is a profound pointer to the existence of a rational intelligence. That makes sense of the universe to me. We can do mathematics, we can understand the universe out there mathematically. Why? Because the same intelligence that created the universe is ultimately responsible for the human mind. That's how it works.
Just on that point,
yes, please.
This morning you talked about how you went and got yourself a Russian dictionary and then taught yourself Russian. I've gone out and bought a few dictionaries, but I'm still not fluent in any of them.
Oh, I've bought many more than that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Them.
But one of the reasons you did that was because you wanted to be able to understand some of the mathematicians that were behind the Iron Curtain.
Yes, that's right. They're brilliant.
Now, they were aware of the mathematical beauty. I mean, these things such as the thing I saw last weekend at the Science Expo. They had a man there with a weight, and he was creating spiral patterns on a piece of paper. Beautiful. And my daughter walked up and looked and said, that's like a Nautilus shell. And then I said, oh, I think there's a mathematical sequence. I think there's a Fibonacci sequence.
Yes, that's right.
And then, so that's the sort of thing you're talking about, where you can see maths in nature, and then it makes you think of other questions.
Wonderful.
What about these mathematicians behind the Iron Curtain? Did you find that they were coming to some of the answers or some of the ideas that you were coming to with maths? Or did they just see maths as a godless operation?
It's very interesting that. The answer to that is mixed. Some of the leading Russian mathematicians were Christians actually, but the problem was with the system, getting through the system to that stage, because there was enormous discrimination in those days. I have many, for example, Jewish friends in Russia, and to talk to them about their difficulty in getting a doctorate, it was horrific. The discrimination, the anti-Semitism and all of that ran in many of the science departments. So the difficulty is you can't statistically say, well, there were very few Christians and so on, because the system discriminated against there being Christians. Oh, but they talked to me about it. I mean, the thing that was fascinating was when I first started going, and that was 89, I went to Siberia, fortunately with a two-way ticket. I immediately met the most extraordinary situation in the mathematics institutes, because I would give a lecture, by that time I could lecture after a fashion in Russian, and they're very kind to you, and they let you have a go and they love it, and it opens every door. So I could lecture in my field in Russian. So when I'd finished, they would politely ask me a few questions about my work, and which they knew and so on. And then he'd say, well, we've got other questions. And I thought, what's coming? So question one from the leader, world famous mathematician. He said, we hear you believe in God. Why? Now, you imagine that happening in Sydney University or Adelaide University in the Maths Department or Cambridge or Oxford. It just wouldn't happen. And then after that, after an hour's discussion, let's all go out for dinner. And that's all they wanted to hear. Night after night for 2 months. I was forced to speak Russian for hours and hours and hours and hours in their little homes. And I remember...
In Siberia?
Yes.
In Siberia.
And it was minus 40. But anyway, I remember one man in his home, and after an evening, he said, you know, he said, you don't know me, he said, but I'm the greatest atheist in this time. And up until this evening, I have thought that faith in God is for very weak-minded elderly people. But he said, you've got to give me time. I said, what do you mean? He said, tonight in my home, I have met arguments that I am incapable of processing intellectually.
Well, that's what I...
Absolutely fascinating.
Well, look, I think that's a good point to bring in the ideas too, that I'm just amazed that we're sitting in this beautiful building here tonight, and it does remind us of the settings that you have in Europe and in the UK. Yes. And you were asked to open the Edinburgh Festival and debate Christopher Hitchens.
Yes.
And apparently the audience at the end of it had to do a show of hands or a clapometer or something.
And at the beginning.
And at the beginning. And you won the debate, which is very interesting. So I don't know how the debate's going tonight, but we're getting questions from the other side now, from the side that are questioning you. Why are you allowed to assert that God had no creator, but you deride Dawkins for claiming the same about the universe?
Because he claims the question, who created the creator, is valid, simply that. So logic would tell me if he claims the universe created him, which he does, I can ask him his own question, which he thinks to be valid. That's perfectly logical. Where I think it goes wrong is his applying it to the God who is eternal, who created the universe and himself was not created.
Right, now on to language. Has your knowledge of language in any way influenced your beliefs? Because there is a wonderful lecture that you've given in Alabama, and if you want to get more of tonight, the joy of the internet is it's there, and you talk about language and the reason why the fundamentalist Christians who believe that the world was created in 7 days are actually wrong, and you do it by deconstructing the language and looking at what the original Aramaic would have been and how those words were put together. You actually do go down into the very deep meanings of words and say you can get meaning from that will explain things such as why you don't have to believe the world was created in a week.
Yes, that's right.
Now, so language plays a key role in your understanding of God as well.
It's enormously important. And, you know, simple things can solve problems that people get hung up on. Just to take the area, not to go into it in detail, unless you want me to, but just the idea that the universe is old, which we've become very familiar with. And as you point out, there are certain people that feel goodness me, that's heresy. Now, it's interesting you asked me that question, because Archbishop Usher, who decided in a letter to the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University, "Dear Sir, Adam was born on the 5th of October, 4004 BC, at 9 o'clock, yes, in the morning, and I'm sorry I can't be more accurate." So I've got a bit to live down, but just to take the point, is the universe old or young? And people claim the Bible says it is, but I'm not a Hebrew expert, so I go to the Hebrew experts. They point out a very simple thing, that the first two statements in the Bible, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then you've got this sequence of days, and point out to me that there are tenses in Hebrew that distinguish between those. The first two verses are in a tense. It changes describing the days. The point of that is that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is describing events that comes before the sequence, and there's no comment on the time. So the Bible says nothing about the age of the earth whatsoever. Now, the interpretation of the days, of course, is a different matter, and I've written a little book about it, which I shall now shamelessly advertise.
Advertise it? Yeah.
7 days that divide the world.
Yeah.
Simply because I meet young people who are passionate about science as I am, and they're stumbled by this, saying, you know, you must interpret the Bible this way. And I want to show them that they can have confidence in the authority of the Bible without going in a direction that makes them look silly in the eyes of their peers. You know?
Well, I mean, it's an amazing thing, because you can actually see you in some of these places in America. I mean, this is a big venue here, but in one of those halls you're in there, it looked about twice the size of the Festival Theatre. It looked like it had somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people in there, and you're talking to the Bible Belt, and you're saying to them...
Well, we got 12,000 in the University of Arizona.
12,000, was it?
There's great interest in this topic.
It is. It's terrific. Now, do you believe that God exists within our four dimensions, or within higher hidden dimensions, or that he, she, exists outside our physics, looking down on a universe as if it was in a fishbowl, says James?
I don't know.
You don't know. Right.
I can speculate. He's speculating.
He's speculating.
Yes, of course. But I'll say something about it, because actually this is seriously interesting. This is where Lewis was great. You know, he hated algebra. He nearly, you know, we nearly lost Lewis because he couldn't do mathematics. Did you know that?
No.
He came up to Oxford and he had a terrible exam that was called responsions, and he failed it. It was a mathematics exam. And he had to do special coaching. And the war intervened, and he never had to sit it. And if he'd had to sit it and lost it, we'd never have had Lewis in Oxford. It's frightening to think that my subject might have kept him out of Oxford, isn't it? But anyway, he wasn't good at algebra. He calls it the lion algebra waits in the path of everybody, you know. But he was good at geometry. And where he's helped me, you asked earlier, has mathematics helped me in my faith in God? Well, here's an area where it has. Because Lewis had a wonderful geometric imagination. And he used the social satire by a man called Abbott in the 1880s. You know, Flatland? Have you come across that? It's a wonderful satire. It's hilarious. Where he imagines a two-dimensional world. And he's got circles and triangles and squares, and they represent the various social hierarchies. It's terrific stuff. And then there's a sphere. There's a three-dimensional world. And of course, the two-dimensional people can only see circles. So the sphere enters their world from above. They see a point, and then the circle widens, and it disappears. And they can't understand this. It's a miracle, you see, because the sphere is in another dimension. Now, it's perfectly possible. The string theorists and people doing elementary particle physics can talk about 11 dimensions, hidden dimensions, all that kind of thing. Well, I'm not a string theorist, and a lot of that is a mystery to me. But the point is, I think that the notion of higher dimensions that's well set in mathematics, we talk about four, space-time is 4 dimensions, there may be many more. And of course, it could easily be like that. What is very clear is that God's relationship to the universe and to time, which is one of our 4 dimensions, is not the same as ours. And so we need to be very careful. How do I know that? Well, when Christ was on earth, he made a very enigmatic statement that I find fascinating. He said, before Abraham was, I am. So that it may be that God sees time in two dimensions, whereas we're moving in time unilinearly, which means, of course, that his knowledge doesn't imply causation. But now we're getting into water that can get so deep and foggy that we'll both drown.
You won't drown, I probably will. I'll be waving. Now, we've got a... how do you know that the mind cannot just be a product of biology and chemistry? Now, this is something that is often put out there, isn't it? That what is the mind if it's not just neurons and chemical things? We see people lose their mind now. It's one of the big worries. We said there's going to be a tsunami of Alzheimer's coming into Australia. So if you lose your mind, then we can show that it's just chemistry, can't we?
This is reductionism. This is physical reductionism. And this is the thing that is now at last being seriously questioned, not only by Christian philosophers, but atheist philosophers. My very last point, Thomas Nagel. He is saying, look, what we've been doing, and I wonder, has he read Lewis? Lewis saw this in the 1940s. He says, we think, but we thought very little about thinking. And he makes the point very powerfully. He said, if you can reduce the mind just to physics and chemistry, you'd never know it. Because you cannot generate meaning bottom up by physics and chemistry. It's exactly the analogy, although I did it on a much simpler level, that physics and chemistry cannot explain to you the semiotics of roast chicken. They just can't do it. And Michael Polanyi is brilliant Hungarian, lived in England, chemist. He recognized this ages ago, and we know it informally. I mean, the illustration he used was, if you've got sand, to a certain extent its composition can determine the kind of bricks you can make of it. But the shape of a brick does not determine the shape of the house you build with a brick. You need an architect to determine that. And the shape of the house doesn't determine the layout of the housing estate. It takes a town planner to do that. And what he's pointing out is there are these hierarchies and levels where you cannot explain the level above exhaustively in terms of the level below. Now, final point, if I may. If you are an atheist, you've got to be able to do that. Because there's no top-down causation. There's only physics and chemistry. So that's why we have a desperate attempt. And that's why Dawkins and co. are utterly furious with Nagel. You just want to see what cyberspace is glowing with hate, because he's saying, look, chaps, it's doomed. Because we're getting to the stage where we see that the mind is not the brain. And the brain cannot be simply the end product of a mindless, unguided process, or else we'd never know it and we could never use it. So that's the way I would begin to approach that kind of question.
I want to ask you another question from mine, but I'm acutely aware of all the questions we're getting in coming through on our text line.
That's wonderful, yeah.
Isn't the Big Bang and evolution agent explanations as well as scientific explanations, and so they destroy the need for God?
No.
Do you want to leave it at that?
No. This is again a confusion. Big Bang, where did that name came from? It came from Sir Fred Hoyle, who was one of my examiners, the famous
Really?
Sir Fred. Yeah. And he didn't like the idea because he believed in a steady state universe. So he said, you're Big Bang. But the Big Bang simply means there was a beginning. And the Bible says, in the beginning, God created. So there was a beginning. So it parallels. This is the fun thing. I remember so clearly when the first evidence from Penzias and so on came in about the so-called hot Big Bang, now the standard model of the universe. It was resisted like the plague by senior members of the British academic establishment, including the editor of Nature, who published an editorial. His name was Maddox, and he said, we cannot go down this Big Bang direction because it'll give too much leverage to people who believe the Bible. Isn't that interesting? That a major scientific advance was resisted because it supported the Bible. And the Big Bang is, as I say, just saying there is a beginning. And I made the point not long ago at a meeting at CERN, which is fascinating, just after they discovered the Higgs boson. We had a big meeting of scientists, philosophers, and so on. And interestingly enough, the title of the meeting was, "Can we find a common language?" And this question came up, and somebody said, look here, the Bible, how can you expect us in the 21st century to say it as anything relevant to say it? I said, well, ladies and gentlemen, take this one thing. For centuries, Aristotle's philosophy of an eternal universe dominated science. If you had listened to the Hebrew scriptures, you might have done some research to see if there was a beginning far earlier than you did. So you could base a prediction on the biblical worldview statement. It claims there was a beginning. Well, perhaps Aristotle's wrong. Let's have a look for some evidence. So it's not as useless as you think. So I don't think there's any problem there. As for evolution, that's slightly more complex. But you see, let me go back to what I said about Newton. When Newton got his law of gravity, he didn't say, I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God. He said, what a wonderful God that did it that way. And many biologists, though by no means all...
Well, tied to Chardin.
Yeah, exactly, at his omega point and so on. Yes, that's right. And many biologists today will take the view, look, God can do it any way he likes. And if he's used the mechanism of natural selection and mutation to do it, that's fine. In other words, what they're saying is the existence of a mechanism that does something is not an argument against the existence of an agent who designed the mechanism. Now, you're talking to a mathematician here, and I have no difficulty with what Darwin observed, the changes in finch beak lengths and so on. Where I begin to raise questions is at the level of, can these mechanisms actually generate new information? Now, that's a huge topic, and I've written on that. But the bottom line is, you cannot deduce atheism from biology. They don't even fit in the same category. And that's why you meet many people who've got a great spectrum of views on evolution, up to accepting it completely, if you define it in the neo-Darwinian sense. You've got also an increasing number of scientists who are at the top of biology seriously questioning the adequacy of the neo-Darwinian mechanism. Now, I'm not a biologist, and of course I transgress into all sorts of subjects, but to deal with that, it's a fascinating thing, and I've written about it in my book, God's Undertaker. But
I'll get it a shameless plug for my program too on 891 Mornings, because last week we had 4 scientists come into the studio, each of them running for the South Australian Scientist of the Year award.
Oh, terrific.
And one of them came in, and I asked her about what she'd learned about reproduction. And she said that we've been doing work with mice where when a mouse is exposed to a certain smell that it particularly dislikes, and they can actually do this, they can actually have the offspring recoil from that smell afterwards, after the next generation, even though they've not...
Lamarckianism, yes, I know.
So if a sperm and an egg at that level can convey a memory smell into the next, that took me to another world. I thought, well, that's
fascinating.
So what other information is being transmitted through one generation to the next? So I'm not sure we fully understand evolution.
But you see, what you're saying is so important because it's all in terms of information.
Professor Robertson from the University of Adelaide, I just thought I'd tell you in case you want to follow that, but that's on the website.
We live in the information age, and this is the problem with the kind of view that Darwin and co developed. They hadn't a clue that there was DNA. They hadn't a clue it was an information-bearing macromolecule, and we're now in the information age. And so the computer scientists, and that's much nearer to my field, theoretical computer science. And you see, one of the things that I've written about in some detail and interests me is the theory of abstract automata. Now, don't worry what that is, because there's a thing called a Turing machine, which is an abstract idea, but it is believed to simulate any computer, past, present, or future. And they've come up with a fascinating result that no Turing machine can create information that's not in its input or in its own informational structure. Now, of course, the cell is a computer. It's an information processing machine. It's much more than that. So if it's true that information cannot be created but only transmitted by natural processes, that seems to me, from the side of theoretical computer science, to be sounding the death knell to materialism, where Thomas Nagel is coming in and saying philosophically, you cannot reduce information to physics and chemistry. Because a moment's thought will show you information is not material. It is often on material carriers, like on that sign over to my left. But information itself is not material. And the great irony of the information age, to my mind, is we've now come to a situation where we recognize information as a fundamental quantity and it's not material. So materialism may make a very rapid exit. And so I'm back to, in the beginning was the Word.
I think one of the things you've raised, which is amazing, is that you say that we should be teaching and thinking more about thinking, which is what Lewis was saying.
Yes.
Do you think that our schools should be doing a lot more other than just educating, but even doing philosophy, doing logic, doing thinking about thinking, and so that we can actually grapple with these issues a bit more?
I would be very happy if they started teaching people to think about anything.
All right, well,
and this isn't a criticism of Australia. I've no right to do that because I met some wonderful students this morning. But I think you're absolutely right. You know, the old Scots universities insisted that everybody learned a bit of philosophy. They learned about thinking. They learned to analyze logical arguments. And I think that should be utterly universal and start in schools, but many schools are doing that. They have courses on worldview, and they introduce young people to different worldviews and thinking about them. I think that is enormously healthy.
Right, now to another question. Your claim that your God is not a God of gaps, yet you posit him as a cause of the universe. Is this not just filling a gap that science will eventually discover?
No, because the nature of the explanations, as I tried to say, is completely different. If you studied motor cars for years, you could say, well, is Henry Ford a Henry Ford of the gaps, an agent of the gaps? That he isn't. What I'm saying is this, that as we look at nature, we discover things that have semiotic character. That is, their information bearing. They have a semantic quality, they carry meaning. Meaning in our experience only comes from one source, and that's intelligence. And what I'm arguing is a very simple argument. If you go back to my illustration of the menu and the language, I made the point there, perhaps very rapidly, too rapidly, that you would never dream of saying the intelligence I postulate for the City Bible Forum sign over here on the left was an intelligence of the gaps. What you would say is the nature of that writing tells you that an intelligence was involved. In other words, you're giving an explanation. There is a gap. There's a gap in the power of physics and chemistry to explain that. But there's no gap in the power of intelligence to explain it. The one can, the other can't. And I would much prefer an explanation that made sense than one that didn't.
Let's get down to a couple of other questions that have come through, and I think these are pretty powerful ones. And we'll start with the Old Testament, then we'll move to the New. Does that sound like a good plan?
Very good, yes.
Right. What's the difference between a bomb and an AK-47 today, and a sword and a spear in the Old Testament? In the Old Testament times, in other words.
Well, not a great deal, obviously, except the bombs and the AK-47 can do a lot more damage. I think the point that's being made, and it's a huge question, and it's a very important question, is that Christ repudiated violence. He said, my kingdom is not of this world, and he explained it.
Well, in that case, do we need the Old Testament?
No, well, in just a moment. We do.
All right.
Christ said, my kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would have been fighting. So he explained what it meant. And of course, Pilate, listening to him, when he said, my kingdom is not of this world, and then he said to this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Pilate said, as a battle-scarred old politician, he said, what is truth? And he knew that Christ was no threat, because he could see that the one thing you cannot do with violence is impose truth. That's the one side of it. So the Christian position is, Christ says no violence, so those who follow him shouldn't use violence to promote. But in the Old Testament, you have Israel as a theocratic state. And you have the situation in the Middle East then, where you had various tribes warring and so on and so forth. Now, I suspect, I may be wrong, that what lies behind that question is the thing that comes up all the time these days, and Christopher Hitchens brought it up, that it seems when the children of Israel came into the promised land and invaded it, the argument is they committed genocide with their swords, and they slaughtered everything around them, and this is utterly terrible because they said God had commanded it. Now, it's a serious objection, but there again, my approach, I'll do it very quickly. I've written a book about it actually recently because a lot of people raise this question. My book, by the way, is entitled Gunning for God.
Gunning for God.
Gunning for God. It's
okay.
ambiguous. The people that take the guns to defend God are the people that shoot God because others have taken guns to defend God. That kind of idea. And I take the question seriously, but I notice a couple of things. Firstly, the description of this alleged genocide in the Old Testament occurs not in some distant, remote part of the Bible. It occurs in the very book of the Bible that in detail proclaims the morality that we use to judge the genocide. Now that's very interesting. As if the text is not ashamed of it. Because love your neighbor as yourself, all of those things appear in the book of Deuteronomy, which describe what Joshua did when he came into the promised land. That's point number one. Point number two is, it appears that Scripture itself is not ashamed of it because it is a back history. And Abraham, the great forefather, whose life fascinates me, he's a towering figure of the ancient world, was told at one stage that his descendants would be held in a foreign land, Egypt, for 400 years, and then they would come out. The reason given for the delay was that the iniquity of the Amorites who possessed the promised land was not full. Deuteronomy then gives the first historical rules for war. And I read with great interest Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, our last chief rabbi, who's a brilliant philosopher. And he makes the point, here in this book we have humanitarian rules of war. Don't sue for peace wherever possible, etc., etc. And it's in that book that you get this apparent destruction. That makes it even more interesting. What on earth is going on? And the short answer, and I know this won't answer the whole question, not even begin to, but my approach to it is this. I want to take all those things seriously into the mix, because Israel were told that if they behaved the same way, they'd get into trouble. This is not the blue-eyed God's favorites going in and bashing folks up. This is people doing something. God gave them the land, and at the same time, he removed people whose violence and evil was a byword in the ancient world. Sacrificing children, all this kind of thing. So that, and here's the difficult thing, people find the concept of God's judgment difficult, and we can come to that in a moment. But the children of Israel came into the land, executed God's judgment. We find that difficult, that humans are allowed to do it. Now, the question of did they destroy everybody? All the people were destroyed. You shall kill them all. It's repeated again and again. One of the world experts in the text of Scripture is Nicholas Wolterstorff, and he's given a lot of study to this. He says, look, if you look at the history, these cities that God commanded apparently to wipe out completely, they existed immediately afterwards. They didn't wipe them out completely. And what he has concluded is that there's a technical phrase that gets repeated so often it must be a technical phrase. It's a bit like saying, all England came to the funeral of Princess Diana. Now, you know what we mean by that. But millions of people didn't come, and people were in bed with flu and all that kind of thing. What we mean is a substantial number. And Woltersdorf has come to the conclusion that this thing, kill them all, actually means score a substantial victory. Now, he may be right and he may be wrong, because I find that partially unsatisfying because it doesn't answer the underlying question. And that is, this was a judgment of God. Does God judge or not? And that has to be faced, and I want to face that head on.
All right. Given all of that, why not be a Buddhist? I raised this with you at one point. I mean, given you believe in a God,
yes,
why Christianity and not other religions? I mean, this is the question. How do you get from the scientific point of view that you've got into Christianity? Where does that, to me, seems to be a leap?
Oh, it is. And it's the question is completely valid, in a sense that the kind of presentation I gave earlier could lead to deism. There is some kind of intelligence out there. And therefore, I accept
Oneness
that.
with the universe?
Yes, yes, absolutely. There is a designer, who, what, etc. Yeah. So you're asking a further question, which is a slightly more personal question, but I'm very happy to answer it. And that is this. Why am I a Christian, not a buzzard? Do you know
we should give John a bit of grace, because he did a breakfast this morning for 1,600 people, went straight from that to do an ABC radio interview. He's come here tonight and he's had his 310. I think you told me you're 310.
Yes, that's right. But it's so funny, you see, on my CV, it says I'm an amateur bird watcher.
Right.
And I went to Harvard or somewhere, and the first question that came was, what is an amateur bird? So, but let me go to your question. I don't want anybody thinking I belong to the buzzard religion.
The old buzzards, yeah.
But let me say this, ladies and gentlemen, and Ian. I take this question very seriously. And the way I approach it, it goes back to my dad and his attitude to other people. Every man and woman, whether they believe in God or not, whether they're Buddhists, Christians, atheists, are of infinite value and they're moral beings. When I discuss the question of other religions, I am not looking down on other people and criticizing their morality. My atheist friends can put me to shame. I'm a broken, sinful person like anybody else. I muck up. And so, as we look around the world, the fascinating thing, and Lewis got this, there's a brilliant appendix in The Abolition of Man, which everybody should read, shortest book written in 1940, where Lewis points out, he says, take every religion, philosophy, paganism, Christianity, Buddhism, you'll always get the golden rule. Do unto others you would be done by. And of course, from where I sit, that makes sense, because that's part of the image of God. So when I try to answer your question, which I'll do now, you must not understand it that it's a criticism of people's ethics, morality, or behavior. The differences between religions don't lie so much there, they lie elsewhere. Now, where do they lie? Well, two different levels. The first level I'll illustrate with the three monotheistic religions, that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. My Muslim friends believe that Jesus did not die. My Jewish friends, of whom I have many, believe that he died and didn't rise. I believe he died and rose. How do you settle that? Well, historically and experientially. You can approach these things because the claim, of course, is a matter of history, and it's also a matter of experience, in the sense that if Jesus actually rose from the dead and is the Son of God, then the claim is he can be met, and if we trust him, we can have our lives transformed. And I've seen that experience many, many times. That's one side of it. The other side of it is this, that if you ask what religion is, and I often do ask people what religion is, let's get the basic elements of religion. They come down to something like Adelaide University. That religion involves a way, a path. And there's usually an entrance, so we'll imagine it as a gate over here. There's a gate in. Some ceremony, initiation, something. So you're in on the way. And I usually draw a wiggly line to indicate that you're up and you're down, and then you've got priests, gurus, imams, people to teach you. But the problem is that however well they teach you, at the end you're on your own because you're facing a judgment, you're facing an assessment. And according to how you do in the assessment, you'll either get through to nirvana, heaven, whatever it is, okay? And most of my friends will agree, roughly speaking, that that is religion. They then find it very strange that I say that that isn't Christianity. Because you see, those systems have one thing in common. They are based on our human merit. So I'm striving with the help of all the teachers, or whatever you call them, to stay on the way in the hope that I will be accepted at the end, because there's going to be an assessment, a judgment, where the good's going to be weighed against the bad. So it's very much a meritocracy. It's like a university. I mean, I'm a kind professor, I hope, at Oxford, and I teach the students. I can't guarantee they're going to get through the finals. So the idea of an initiation, away, and finals is the usual description of religion. Indeed, it's what many people think Christianity is. But you see, it isn't. Because the complete difference here is this, that Christ came into the world and he said, I am the door. The initiation is not a ceremony, it's a person. And he said, he that hears my word and believes on him that sent me shall not come into judgment, but has already passed from death to life. He claims to be the judge at the last day. Now this is staggering, ladies and gentlemen, absolutely staggering. Let's get what it means. Christ is claiming that he's going to be the judge at the last day. And he tells me here on earth in this life that because he's died for me, if I trust him, I can receive right now forgiveness and know that I am accepted. Now, let me put it to you. I often put it to many, many people in all kinds of religions. I say to them, think of marriage. Now, suppose I met a girl, which I did on day one at Cambridge. I married her. And I came to her and said, Sally, I'd like you to be my wife. So here's a cookbook. And it's full of laws. So here's the law for Apfelstrudel, you know, apple cake. Yep. Thou shalt take so much flour, and thou shalt take so much sugar, and thou shalt take so much water, and thou shalt mix it and heat it to a temperature of so and so. Now, if you keep these rules for, let's say, 40 or 50 years, and I'll think of accepting you. So, would you like to be my wife? Well, you can. I'm glad you're laughing, ladies and gentlemen. Do you know that's what millions of people think of God? That's exactly what millions of people think of God. Here's the rule book. I'll try and keep it. Maybe you'll accept me. You would never insult a fellow human being by basing a relationship on merit like that. Now, I did marry Sally, and the amazing thing was she accepted me. It wasn't amazing I accepted her. The amazing thing was she accepted me. Because you imagine a wife who became a wife on the basis of the first system. So she tries to make an apple cake, and then she suddenly realizes, if I don't do this perfectly, I'm back to my mother. So she turns the oven up to 1,000 degrees centigrade, and out comes a burnt offering. That's slavery, ladies and gentlemen. And if you misinterpret Christianity as a slavery, it's no wonder it doesn't appeal to you. You see, do you know what sets my wife free to cook? And she's brilliant. It's because she knows her cooking is not a condition of my acceptance of her. And ladies and gentlemen, it's the same with God. You see, the wonderful thing is this. Because it doesn't depend on my merit, but on God's gift and grace. I'm not doing this thing tonight in order to gain God's acceptance. What a good boy am I. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm doing it because I got God's acceptance. That's the difference. And I explained to my friends of different religions, I said, you know, Jesus is not competing with your religion because he offers me something that no other religion offers me. He offers me forgiveness and certainty in this life because of what he has done, not because of what I have done. That's the difference, and it's vast. It lies not at the level of morality, it lies at the level of what is the basic way in which we become related to God.
Thank you very much. I think it's a pretty good point to end on. You happy with that?
Oh, I'm very happy.
Are you?
And ladies and gentlemen, I think you really ought to thank an absolutely brilliant interviewer.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It's been very wonderful. Thank you. You've been very generous.
Well, I feel like I've gone around the world tonight. It's very exhausting. We started with science and we've ended with philosophy and moved right through a whole range of topics tonight. But it's been fascinating, and it's been a superb conversation to have, one that's been marked by grace and honesty, and it's been penetrating. It's made me think. Look forward to seeing you at future City Bible Forum events. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Please thank our guests again, please.